My name is Jo Blake, a student at the University of Winchester, and in this presentation I will be discussing whip use in horse racing and its implications for racehorse welfare. In the course of this presentation, I will discuss background information relating to horse racing in Great Britain, whip use in racing with regards to how they are used and why, recent changes to rules relating to whip use in British horse racing. I'll then go on to discuss implications of whip use for racehorse welfare along with findings of studies investigating this area. I'll also look at some animal welfare charity perspectives and finally summarise and draw conclusions from the points discussed. Horse racing under rules in Great Britain is governed and promoted by the British Horse Racing Authority, or BHA. According to the BHA, the industry is worth over £4 billion to the British economy in direct, indirect and associated expenditure every year. As more has been learned and understood about animal welfare from research over time, however, society is becoming increasingly aware and concerned about horse welfare in the racing industry, and the BHA and industry as a whole has felt pressured to recognise that awareness and concern and to act accordingly. In order to try to future-proof the industry by continuing to secure interest from new and younger audiences, there have been a number of changes to racing rules over the years relating to areas such as safety of jumps and whip use, for example. British horse racing has a long-standing history and relies upon an informal licence based on trust, credibility and confidence known as the social licence to operate, or social contract. In November 2022, in a discussion in the House of Lords relating to horse racing, Lord Trees, who is himself a vet, stated, "I should emphasise that assurance about the welfare of horses underpins the social contract between the industry and the British public. I need hardly stress that this cannot be taken for granted in a public who increasingly question and value animal welfare." Those in horse racing look to the significant decline of greyhound racing in recent decades, which has been driven in no small part by animal welfare concerns relating to overbreeding, limited retirement options and injury risks amongst others, all of which raise similar questions in horse racing. In addition, whilst greyhounds chase as a predator species, horse racing relies upon horses' flight instinct, which, in and of itself, could be considered an aversive experience for racehorses. This further raises questions over the ethics of horse racing as an industry. So how is the whip used in horse racing? Perhaps the most controversial use for the whip is to encourage a horse to maintain their speed or run faster, to hold or improve their finishing time and position in a race. This purpose for the whip, already banned in Norway, has recently been banned in Sweden following review of scientific evidence, and it can now only be used for safety purposes. Whips are deemed to be important as a safety aid to support steering and avoid interference between competitors, to consider the welfare and safety of horses and their jockeys during races. In line with concerns around welfare and use of the whip to strike a horse, there are penalties for excessive use of the whip in this way. Table 1 shown here outlines what is deemed to be acceptable and unacceptable use of the whip when it is used under British racing rules. Despite arguments in favour of whip use for encouragement, hands and heels races exist in both flat and jumps racing in Britain, in which the whip can be held by a jockey but only used for safety and correction, not to strike a horse for encouragement. Following a public consultation held in 2021 around the use of the whip in horse racing, British Horse Racing's whip report was published in July 2022 and cited improving standards and enhanced deterrence as being core to the recommendations it made. These 20 recommendations focused on the need to develop rules which foster more considered and judicious use of the whip for encouragement, greater focus on education and improving standards of use, consistency of stewarding, and a penalty framework which acts as an effective deterrent against misuse. The recommendations included limiting use of the whip for encouragement to the backhand only, as horses could not be struck with as great a force from this angle as forehand whip strikes. Increased penalties for offences when the whip is deemed to have been used excessively, above the permitted level. And the introduction of disqualification for any offence in which the whip has been used 4 times or more above the permitted level in all races. In non-hands and heels races, the whip can be used a maximum of 6 times in flat races, and in jumps races, 7 times. Any more than these numbers would result in stewards reviewing the ride. However, Initial recommendations with regards eradicating forehand use of the whip were later removed from the new rules, which came into force earlier this year, after pressure from professional jockeys who argued those who had suffered injuries to the collarbone in the past, for example, would struggle to be able to use a backhand position. Concerns around how whip use in horse racing might be perceived persist, however. In promoting the Cheltenham Festival this year, promotional posters and materials featuring jockey Rachel Blackmore riding a horse and holding her hand aloft caused debate after the original photo of her showed that in fact she had been holding a whip in her hand. Whip use in racing has a number of implications for racehorse welfare. There are concerns around pain caused by strikes with a whip. In the 2011 study, McGreevy and Oddie found that jockeys tend to hold their whip in their dominant hand, regardless of the direction of the track. This would provide greater opportunity to strike a horse with more force when looking to do so. Studies have been undertaken to investigate how pain is felt in horses. Tong et al. In 2020 looked at cutaneous pain sensation and found that humans and horses have similar anatomic structures to detect cutaneous pain, which suggests horses may feel the pain of being struck by a whip in a similar way that humans might. The cutaneous trunci is the muscle responsible for fly twitch in horses. Ultimately, if a horse can feel and react to a fly landing on their skin, it's hard to consider that they would not find being struck by a whip painful. Discussion has also taken place regarding whip design to alleviate the potential to cause harm to a horse. Thoma et al. In 2020 worked to quantify the forces exerted on a flat target plate using 3 different riding crops in order to determine which type or design was least likely to leave a mark on a horse's skin. Whilst the force of a whip strike depends on the core and the popper components of the whip design and manufacture, they found the crop core played the more significant role of the two in the resulting force of a strike. This therefore has significant implications for racehorse welfare, where whips are allowed to be used to strike a horse. McLean and McGreevy argue that the use of the whip in racing is controversial and, because it does not always lead to acceleration, problematic. They go on to argue that ethical equitation demands that horses should be trained to respond to minimal pressures. In their 2020 study exploring the importance of whip use in horse racing to racing integrity, Thompson et al. Analysed stewards' reports for 126 races involving 1,178 starters over 3 years in Great Britain. They compared whip-free and whip-use races and found no statistically significant differences to race finishing times, which suggests striking a horse to encourage greater effort or speed is simply ineffective. The whip is said to be used for safety, to steer to avoid collision and avoid interference, in addition to lessening incidents of falls and injuries to both racehorses and jockeys. Pinchbeck et al. Undertook a study which used video footage of races run at 6 UK racecourses, considering falls during racing and to what degree they present a risk of injury to racehorses and jockeys, and risk of fatality to racehorses. The races included in the study were all either steeplechase or hurdle fence races. The study found that the risk of falling heavily correlated with use of the whip. They stated, horses which were being whipped were more than 7 times at risk of falling compared to those not being whipped. In addition, the earlier mentioned study by Thompson et al. Also found no evidence that whip use improves steering, reduces interference or increases safety. Whilst in Australia, McGreevy and Oddie expected to find in their study that jockeys would carry the whip in different hands dependent upon the direction of the racetrack to aid steering and avoid a horse drifting around bends. However, the evidence they gained from their research did not support this theory. Wild Horse Welfare recognise the whip as being an aversive that may cause fear and/or pain in racehorses. They argue the whip is typically not used in a way compatible with the growing evidence of learning theory. Negative reinforcement is the critical control mechanism in equitation, according to McLean and McGreevy. Whip use in races tends to be concentrated in the final stages when a horse is likely to be most fatigued, and McLean and McGreevy go on to state that perhaps the most nonsensical use of the whip in racing occurs when horses are hit as they accelerate or when they cannot accelerate. In this way, rather than encouraging the giving of effort, the whip action discourages it by acting as a positive punishment rather than a negative reinforcer for the behaviour. Unable to escape the whip, the horse may habituate to it to some degree or may develop learned helplessness as a response. McLean and McGreevy highlight an increase in hyperreactivity, fear and stress, fearful associations with the punisher in context, as well as potentially making the horse fearful to trial new responses. Thompson et al. In their 2020 study cite the International Society for Equitation Sciences position, which focuses on the removal of the aversive stimulus as being more important than the application, stating that it should be applied conservatively and removed with pinpoint accuracy. This may be extremely hard for a jockey to gauge during a race, with significant negative impact on a racehorse's welfare. So moving on now to consider some animal welfare charity perspectives. World Horse Welfare and the RSPCA advise the BHA with regards welfare standards in horse racing. Their positions regarding whip use in racing are as outlined. So for World Horse Welfare, we support the use of whip for safety. We believe that a rider should be able to use the whip for safety or to ask their horse to concentrate. However, appropriate use for safety or concentration should be carefully defined. They go on to state, however, in horse racing, in addition to being used for safety, the whip is also used to encourage the horse to run faster and so maintain or advance their position in the race. This use of the whip is controversial, as it is increasingly incompatible with society's views on the acceptable treatment of animals and the evidence base on how horses learn. The RSPCA's position is here also. As the British Horse Racing Authority are already running races under hands and heels rules, our position is that the use of the whip for encouragement should cease, and that British racing be the first major racing nation to lead the field in moving all racing to hands and heels, where the whip can be carried but only used for safety reasons which the jockey is required to justify at steward's inquiry, and that further research be conducted to identify whether the whip needs to be carried at all. So both of these organisations, as advisors to the racing industry, both believe that using the whip for encouragement is not appropriate and that further research is needed. Animal advocacy organisations, in contrast, such as Animal Aid, are categorical in supporting a full ban on the use of the whip in horse racing. To summarise and conclude, horse racing is a historic and valuable industry, contributing large amounts of money to the British economy through tax, betting revenue and employment. It needs to retain its social licence to operate and so needs to consider advances in understanding around animal welfare and behaviour and ensure that it adjusts its operation accordingly to continue attracting crowds and interest longer term. There are a number of concerns around racehorse welfare in horse racing. However, whip use is a particularly controversial area, particularly given the findings of an increasing number of studies in recent decades. Welfare concerns with regard to whip use in horse racing centre on a number of factors, including ethics around the use of whips as an aversive technique in line with greater understanding of learning theory, and the potential pain experienced by use of the whip on racehorses. Even if whip use were supported by evidence as being effective in resulting in the required outcomes, which it is not currently, there are significant implications involved for racehorse welfare. Society can continue to push for better welfare standards with regards to whip use in horse racing using the social licence to operate, particularly with regards demanding and actively encouraging further research to be undertaken with regards use both for encouragement and for safety and steering, in line with views from both the RSPCA and World Horse Welfare. At present, the BVA, the British Veterinary Association, Progressive Veterinary Association, RSPCA and World Horse Welfare have all expressed concerns around whip use for encouragement specifically, yet British horse racing is yet to rule it out, unlike racing bodies in both Norway and Sweden. Thank you very much for listening.